Welcome to yet another episode where we go through all of the different thought processes and procedures that I had to follow to get this particular looping result in Blender. This was probably one of the longest yet. Because of the intense amount of geometry, there was even a section that crashed my computer. I'm not sure how much of compression is going on YouTube and whether you can see the final product perfectly or not, but hopefully it's good enough for you to understand what's being seen, and let's directly get into how I went about creating this. I knew that this entire effect would be made using geometry nodes. And so I wanted to create a grid where I would place these particular spheres. In the previous video, I was trying to create a glass material in Eevee. However, I forgot to uncheck or to actually check the refraction button in the materials, which is why I wasn't able to create the glass material and I had to improvise with a different material altogether. So the first thing I wanted to do was try and create the materials to see if I could figure out what went wrong in the previous video. After creating the two icospheres and subdividing them to make them more or less spherical, I created two materials, assigned them to the object, and then went on to actually change the materials. Here I realized that taking the refraction button in the material was able to give me a sort of see-through material, which is exactly what I wanted for this particular effect. The other material for the inner sphere was pretty much the same as what I wanted to do in the previous video, so you can check that out over here if you wish to see it. Since I now created the icospheres, I decided I'd create the grid that I initially thought I'd have along with the icospheres for this particular animation. The entire grid process is also the same as in the previous video. Since this was going to be a looping animation, I wanted the camera to also go around in a circle, and I thought that maybe I'd do that using a Bezier circle and making the camera follow the path and have it locked to the center. However, I wasn't able to figure out how to keep the camera perfectly aligned towards the center. Another problem that I realized over here, I have no idea why, and I thought that I'd figure out while watching the video of me doing this again, but I still haven't figured out what went wrong, is the distances were messed up. For some reason in Blender, 0.1 meters was way more than 1 meter. Everything seemed like it was just way too big. It was completely out of proportions. So areas where it should have been like just a few meters wasn't. It was just far larger. The tiniest movements was creating a huge movement. So I decided just to start a new file and do exactly what I did up to that point. So that's what I'm doing over here. I'm recreating everything that I just did. Except this time I won't be focusing on the materials of the icospheres right now, and instead I'll be focusing on creating the grid. Once I was happy with how the spheres were looking, I realized that I'd have to instance the spheres onto the grid. However, I temporarily forgot exactly what the difference between instances on points and instances to points was, so I had to just fiddle around with it to recall exactly how you can instance points or instance objects onto those particular points in geometry nodes. Once I instanced the spheres onto the points, I realized that the distance between them was way too high. So I just shrunk the entire grid since I made that using geometry nodes and I thought that that would make it more modular. However, it was right at that point that I realized the displacement modifier wouldn't work the way that I was expecting it to work. We'll probably come across that in just a few seconds. Right here, I realized that the displacement modifier won't be able to modify a grid that was created in geometry nodes. So essentially, if I was to use this displacement modifier, I would have to create the grid separate from the geometry nodes. And so that is exactly what I did. I initially thought that I'd use the same geometry nodes and use that grid instead by using the object info node. However, I quickly realized that that method simply wouldn't work, and so I had to create the geometry nodes in the plane object itself. And then once you have it in the same object, instead of using object info, you just use geometry to get it to work properly. At least that's what I found out from the experiment that I was doing right over here. And that's when I created the displacement texture and I got the clouds and I just increased the scale so that it became nice, soft displacement. After I placed the camera over here, I wanted to create the camera in such a way that it would loop around the circle and make it perfectly loopable. However, this is where I was unsuccessful in figuring out how to keep it locked to the center. So I had to go back to the same method that I've been using in a few of my previous videos. The reason why I wanted to try using a curve for the camera's motion this time was to test out a newer method rather than having the exact same control method that I have already been using in the last few days. Hopefully these videos actually give an idea of how much of trial and error goes into creating something. And it's when most of these creators show tutorials, they already have tested all of this out and figured it out at least once so that they have a rough idea of what works and what doesn't work. That's why I'm creating this particular series where I show every single step that I went through while creating any of these looping animations that I create. Future videos, I might even create just wallpapers, single images, rather than complete looping animations. But till then, it's nice to know how much of testing goes in. So it's not to be disheartened when you don't get something nice in your exact first attempt when you're trying to create something by yourself. So over here, I realized that I wanted to start increasing the density of the spheres within this geometry node. And I quickly realized that if I was just to take my grid that I initially had and subdivide it, it would cause my laptop to crash and be really slow. So I thought instead of subdividing the grid right there, I could just add a subdivision modifier, and that would do the exact same thing, except I'd have control and I could actually finish the entire animation with a subdivision level of just 1 or even 0. And then later on, just before rendering, I could see how it would look if it was at the maximum subdivisions of possibly 3. So I really wanted the spheres to be extremely small and have a really dense net of the spheres. However, I realized once the density starts increasing, the actual grid that I had isn't even visible that much. So I eventually removed the grid, which we'll see soon enough. Right here, I tried to change the view to 3, but Blender completely crashed. It wasn't responding for over 10 minutes. I've cut out that particular section because it's not worth it. And yeah, so I had restarted Blender and I used the autosave files that I could find from the recovery. And the first thing that I did was remove the grid to create this and work with just a level 0 for the subdivisions so that I could finish off the entire animation first. I also wanted the entire displacement itself to move like as if they were waves. So I used the same procedure that we were using to create the displacement for the plexus style animations. And I eventually had to tweak a few settings of that as well, just because of the way the displacement was looking through the camera. We also had to change the positioning of the camera as well later on. I actually really liked the way the waves were looking in this particular way, but even those had to be changed eventually soon enough. I also had to create multiple versions of this Blender file. I kept saving it as version 1, version 2, and so on and so forth, because I was pretty confident that Blender might just crash again, and in case it does crash, I'd have to make sure that I have a nice version that I can go back to such that it doesn't go too hard on my CPU, and I could possibly make other artistic decisions maybe in the future with different versions of the different things that I'm saving. Also over here, I realized that the subdivisions, since I was making the spheres really small, I didn't need the subdivisions to actually be that as high as I had, and that would greatly reduced the entire computations required by my laptop to preview what it looks like even at the densest settings. I also realized that because the spheres are that small, maybe I don't even require two spheres and just one sphere would be enough. However, I did realize that even though the spheres are small, they do make a very tiny difference, especially for the spheres that are closer to the camera and can be seen. You can tell a difference between having one sphere and two spheres, and the sizes also vary. So I just decided to leave it as two spheres. Also, considering the amount of time that I spent on them, I just thought that it was worth it. If it absolutely didn't make any difference whether there were two or one spheres, then no matter how much of time I spent creating them, it wouldn't make sense to add them in the final render. But this particular case, I felt like it just made some sense. So then I decided that there was a lot of white space in the background, or just empty space in the background. So I wanted to lift the entire plane up towards the camera so that more of the actual field of view is covered. However, that caused its own issues because we were now actually colliding with the plane in certain portions of the render, which we'll see in a few seconds. As usual, I say this in almost every video, that if you guys want tutorials of exactly how this works, of how to create these types of abstract looping animations, let me know and I'll make maybe step-by-step guides rather than me just talk about what I'm doing. And if you guys want the actual Blender files as well, maybe that also I could figure out a way of giving them out as well. So let me know what you guys would want and we'll go ahead with doing it. So over here, I realized that although everything was looping and all of that, there wasn't really enough of a motion to the waves. The displacement didn't have any motion. So even though it was moving around, it just wasn't showing up in the camera, and I realized that's because we were displacing the coordinates with respect to the empty sphere, and the empty sphere itself was moving in the exact same way that the camera is moving. So it's likely that the coordinates were all following the same geometry and there's very little actual motion being seen. So the way I thought I'd fix that is by changing the direction of the empty itself. So instead of having it rotate in the exact same direction as the camera, I'd shift it from clockwise to anti-clockwise. However, once I did that, I also realized that in situations just like this, we were actually chopping through the plane and things were getting cut off, so I had to increase the height of the camera. But even after increasing the height of the camera, I happened to notice that there were areas where we were still getting cut off by the plane. And also due to the sheer amount of geometry being rendered in every frame, this was probably the fastest that I could actually go through to check each of these particular situations. And remember that this video that you're seeing right now is already sped up to 2.5 times the original speed. So while I was actually creating this, it took me much longer to go through each particular frame. So after quite a lot of tweaking and changing position of the camera, I finally got something where we weren't having too many intersections with the plane. Not too many, we weren't having any intersections with the plane at all. And we were getting some sort of motion, a good enough motion in the displacement as well, so that we could see the actual waves moving in the displacement. I also realized that right now it was looking fast enough and it was not even going at 15 frames per second. So once it goes to 30 frames per second, it would have sped up way too much. So I decided that I'd shift everything to 600 frames so that it becomes half the speed, and hopefully once it renders out at 30 frames per second, it'll look slow enough to look good. I knew that I wouldn't be able to render this out as a video format in case it crashes, so I decided to render it out as a sequence of PNG images first, and that's why I set it up as PNG, and then I just had to render the animation to finally create this. It's perfectly looping all of the spheres, forming waves that hopefully you learned something from this particular video, and you can create your own sorts of abstract sci-fi motion graphics. Be sure to subscribe and also check out these other videos, and we'll definitely make much more, probably every alternate day or at least 3 videos a week. So stay tuned for all of that. Thank you for watching, and bye-bye.